The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
But as always, when I teach, I invite folks to interject, to jump in. So if you've got a question or if you've got a comment, throw up your hand. I'll call on you as soon as I can. Try to wait till you discern that I have reached the end of a sentence. Anyway, this is Thriving in the Crosscurrent, and actually the idea of this book, Thriving in the Crosscurrent, subtitle, as Sochi said, is hope or clarity and hope in a time of cultural sea change. Sea change is my term for a radically dramatic acceleration in cultural evolution. So I'm going to begin by saying something about my book, which also applies to Robert Wright's book, The Evolution of God. Robert Wright is one of the thinkers that I identify in Thriving in the Crosscurrent. I focus on a number of thinkers, but there are four that I recognize as extraordinary voices in the advance of cultural evolution. So Robert Wright and I agree on at least one thing. Actually, I asked him to write a blurb for the book, and he said he just didn't have time, but he was anxious to read the book, and he would, and if down the road he found time to write a comment, he would be happy to do that. But we agree on one thing, and that is this: cultures do not merely change, they evolve. Now that's an extraordinarily controversial kind of notion. And I have to begin by saying that the whole idea of cultural evolution has a very checkered and really, you'd have to say, dark history. And Robert Wright acknowledges this. Jared Diamond, who wrote the great book, Guns and Germs and Steel, right? Also acknowledges the problem of espousing the notion of cultural evolution. And he does it in Guns and Germs and Steel, and Bob Wright does it in The Evolution of God, and I do it in Thriving in the Crosscurrent. Here's why it's such an ugly idea. The notion of human cultural evolution as opposed to biological evolution grew up, obviously, in the wake of Darwinian theory. And Darwin came along and said, first he published in 1859, on the origin of species, and then 11 years later in 1871 he brought the conversation over to human evolution, and he wrote On the Descent of Man. And by the way, the whole monkey business thing did not enter the conversation until that 1871 book. When he talked about origin of species, he was not talking about human beings, although he was pointing in that direction. Well, anyway, after both books had emerged, we have the idea, let me pause and say this, we have the idea that there was this huge outcry, and religious folks in Great Britain and perhaps even on the continent were all in I'm not sure what they get into, I think it's a flutter, perhaps a paroxysm, even apoplexy in certain cases if it's called for, but actually that wasn't the case. One of the most telling remarks was this by the wife of of a fellow that is usually referred to as a divine. And a divine was a term that was used at the time to indicate a member of the hierarchy of the Church of England, so probably a bishop. Anyway, the wife of what was probably a bishop somewhere in the vicinity of London said, "I sincerely hope that Mr. Darwin shall not be proved correct. But if he should be, I devoutly wish that his views should not become widely known." That's kind of the extent of the hue and cry. I mean, it's like, this is sort of a difficult idea. It's a problematic idea. We don't much care for it. But, you know, all the stuff that we hear today, the tremendous revulsion in the face of the idea of evolution, the idea that your uncle was somehow a monkey, right, is way out of proportion when you compare it to what actually happened in the time of Darwin. But a more insidious reaction did in fact take place. Many of Darwin's contemporaries, and chief among them was Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer was a philosopher. He was a not social activist, but a social luminary. And he decided that what Darwin had said about the evolution of biological species, how biological forms and structures and so on change over time, why is it that the beaks of finches on the Galapagos Islands, and you know that's one of the very first things that Darwin noticed, that there were many different species of finches. If you have a bird feeder, chances are in this area you see a number of different kinds of finches, and they have different beaks. Well, Darwin noticed that there were lots of finches on the Galapagos Islands. He had signed on as a naturalist on board the ship the Beagle. The British Navy often did that. They recruited scientists to go along and catalog new species and so on. Anyway, Darwin got one of these much prized gigs, as it were, and he noticed that the finches in the Galapagos Islands had lots of different kinds of beaks. And he noticed also that the beaks with which they were endowed seemed to be perfectly adapted to the kinds of foods that they ate. So the large-beaked finches ate large seeds, and the smaller-beaked finches ate smaller seeds, and so on. So which comes first, the seed or the beak? So anyway, it's an interesting kind of thing. Then he got fascinated with Galapagos Island tortoises and so on, and began to wonder why they had developed in the way they had, and why the differences that were evident between various types of these tortoises had emerged. Well, eventually he hit on the idea of evolution, and he hit on the idea of natural selection. And I want to suggest how important that is to Robert Wright, to my own book, and to Charles Darwin's idea of biological evolution. Natural selection, the best way to talk about it is to speak of it figuratively, and to imagine that nature has some sort of intent, that nature is working to bring out the best in a given species. Now, of course, you have to recognize at the first blush that requires a willing suspension of disbelief, okay? Nature is not working to do anything. Ultimately, evolutionary biologists would say this is all random and so on, but it works out almost as though nature had a plan. And this is the way that seems, from the Darwinian point of view, to evolve. Nature will throw out a zillion different designs, and some of them will be adaptive. In other words, they will enhance the survival characteristics of a given species. And what do we mean by survival? You live longer, and what's really the key? You live longer and you propagate, you reproduce. So really, you know, it's all about dating and so on, successful dating. So living longer is very important, but you really want to produce as many offspring as possible. The idea is that you might be the inheritor of some really accidental mutation, which is a slight shift in your genetic makeup that might, for example, endow you with, a tiny bit more in the way of lung capacity, right? Or you might be endowed with the ability to process, sugars more effectively and thus to have more energy to work with. You might have a slightly larger brain. Suggestion is these days among evolutionary biologists that probably the initial advantage of a slightly larger brain was that it cooled the blood more effectively than a smaller brain. So the brain may very well have evolved as a radiator. But let's say you ended up with you're just one of a litter of pre-human, I'm not sure why I'm picking on you, but of hominids, of pre-humans, and you have a slightly larger brain than your litter mates, right? That might just give you the advantage, especially if you were born at a time when human beings are moving down out of the trees and out onto the savanna because of population pressures, food pressures, who knows what. We do know that pre-humans, hominids, moved down out of the trees and out onto the savanna where they would be exposed to more intense rays of the sun and so on. So you have a slightly larger brain that can circulate more blood and radiate more heat, and who knows? The idea, of course, is that your slightly larger brain would eventually lend itself to other pursuits such as opera. I've always resisted that notion because I'm not sure that opera is evolutionarily advanced, but that's just me. Well, anyway, so the notion is that human beings, or that all life tends in the direction of greater and greater complexity. Now, what I have just said is to this day extraordinarily controversial in biological evolutionary circles. Do we really move in the direction, does all life move in the direction of greater and greater complexity, or is it rather random? The late Stephen Jay Gould, one of the truly successful popularizers, and when I say popularizer, I don't mean to detract from his serious scientific work. He's a respected scientist and did great work, but he was also really adept in explaining some of this complex stuff to us in wonderful books like The Flamingo's Smile and The Panda's Thumb and so on. If you haven't read either of those, pick them up. I mean, he's a great explainer of evolution, but he also said this: the progress of evolution resembles nothing so much as the random nighttime stagger of a drunk. So if you're looking for any kind of progress or move in the direction of greater and greater complexity, forget it. He put it in a wonderful way. He said, yeah, here's the drunk wandering down the street, and there's a wall on the side. Inevitably, he's going to drift farther and farther away from that wall. If you call that progress, okay, you can, but it's not real progress. However, I would say that most people who work in the field of biological evolution believe that we move, that all life, when I say we, not just human, but all life moves toward greater and greater complexity, more and more complex forms. Well, anyway, Darwin laid most of that out. Herbert Spencer, one of Darwin's contemporaries, decided that what Darwin had said about biology ought certainly to apply to culture. And so he said, well, if biological forms evolve, so too must cultural forms. And so it's up to us to look for the most highly evolved cultural forms, and where are they to be found? Well, for Herbert Spencer, they were to be found in his immediate vicinity, right? They were to be found among the peers of the realm, right? They were to be found among the most educated, the wealthiest, the highest classed of British culture. And so here's where it all came down. He said, look, if we believe that evolution is committed to the survival of the fittest, it's a very important point to make, that Darwin did not coin the term survival of the fittest. Unfortunately, I have to confess that Darwin eventually borrowed that term from Herbert Spencer and used it once or twice, but it was not Darwin's term. Darwinian biology doesn't talk about the survival of the fittest, nor should it. Philosophers among you will recognize that the survival of the fittest is what we call a tautology. It's true, but it's so obviously true that it doesn't advance our knowledge at all, right? So who survives? The fittest. What do you mean by the fittest? Them that survives. So have we advanced our conversation? No, not at all. It's sort of like saying red is a color. Yeah. Now what? Okay, so the survival of the fittest. But anyway, Herbert Spencer eventually came down on this point. He said, therefore, it is a huge mistake for the British government to feed the hungry, to aid the poor, to try to lift up the lower classes. Let them sort themselves out. And his idea, which was a misappropriation, do you understand what I'm saying? Of course you do. A misappropriation of Darwinian biology came to be called social Darwinism. And social Darwinism down through the ages got uglier and uglier until it finally eventuated in what we call eugenics. And the eugenics movement was very, very big in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. And as a matter of fact, at state fairs from about 1915 to about 1925, you would almost always see a contest for the most American family. What were they looking for? They weren't looking for the Cleavers, because the Cleavers weren't blonde. We're looking for blonde, blue-eyed, matching cheekboned, perfectly genetically matched specimens, even though you understand that genetics was not part of our vocabulary. At the time, we didn't know from genetics, but we were anticipating it. And do you understand that it's a very short step from eugenics to Nazism, right? So I could actually go back and say that this same social Darwinism also eventuated in some of the most powerful arguments in favor of slavery during the time of the Civil War. It's quite obvious that certain people are to be subservient and certain others are to be masters, and the masters ought to be kind to the subservient, and so on. So anyway, the idea of cultural evolution has a nasty, dark history, and it's really hard to bring it up. So I do. And so does Robert Wright. And we both bring it up with acknowledgement, as does Jared Diamond. We all bring up this idea, which has entered its own renaissance or renaissance. We bring it up with apologies for its misuse and abuse in the past, but to say one thing, that whether you're talking about the history of religion, as Robert Wright does, or whether you're talking about the history of human culture, as I do, or whether you're talking about the history of individual human cultures, as Jared Diamond does, it's important to say that we do gradually get better. My argument is a fairly simple one, and I think Bob Wright shares it, that human culture moves inexorably, steadily, very slowly, sometimes imperceptibly, but steadily in the direction of what? In the direction of a closer fit between its values and reality. So one of the things I talk about is our misunderstanding of the relationship between the genders. We were absolutely certain for a we men were absolutely certain for a long, long time that women were simply inferior in every significant way. It's my notion that women were aware of the flaw in that reasoning some 2 millennia ago, and most men tumbled to it sometime last week. But in any case, gradually, our understanding of reality changes, and then ever so slowly our values catch up. Gradually, we begin to realize that war doesn't make much sense as a means of resolving our conflicts, and gradually our values catch up. We eventually come to realize that social and economic justice and human rights are critical, are absolutely essential, and Bob Wright talks about this in great detail, and slowly our values catch up. So we're both, and that's enough about mine, I hope you'll pick it up and read it, but Bob Wright and I are, at least in this regard, on the same page. We believe that human culture evolves. In other words, it moves in the direction of a closer fit, a closer match between prevailing dominant values, in his case, religious values, religious themes, religious ideas, and our best understanding of reality. So he calls his book The Evolution of God. But it's actually not about the evolution of God. Does Bob Wright believe that God evolves? Say no. Does God Wright believe in God? Say, it's not entirely clear that he believes in God. Does he believe in the patriarchal father figure, creator God that ordains all and that presides over the universe with fine attention, lifting up this person, putting down that person, healing that sick child, bringing rain here, and of course, when you bring rain in a complex meteorological system, you have to bring it from somewhere. So I always think about the farmer who didn't get the rain because he didn't pray for it. But in any case, does Bob Wright believe any of that? No. Does Bob Wright, is he open to the, and I want to say this at the get-go, is he open to the possibility that there might be some sort of built-in tendency in the universe that if you were so inclined, you might want to identify with a divine or with a God or with a... He is definitely open to that. Now let me back up and take you back to Bob Wright's last book. I would say if you were going to read One of Bob Wright's books, his most recent 3 books, are The Moral Animal, in which he explores the idea of altruism. Why is it that we human beings, and he explores it from a point of view that I will explain to you in a moment, it's the point of view of evolutionary psychology, which is the sort of sister study of evolutionary biology. Let me just tell you this right now. Evolutionary biology asks, why do living forms take the forms that they take, right? Why is it, for example, that some flowers reproduce sexually and some flowers reproduce asexually? Why is it that we have 2 lungs and are bipedal? Why is it that mammals incubate their young as they do? Why is it that reptiles reproduce in a radically different way? Why is it that living forms get their nourishment in the variety of ways that they do? Why is it that different climes and environmental, you know what I'm saying, environmental regions produce radically different life forms? That's evolutionary biology. Evolutionary psychology really focuses its attention on human beings, and it asks, why do we behave as we do? So evolutionary psychology is really interested in our mating activity. Right? Evolutionary biology is fascinated by the fact that males of the variety of avian bird species are the more brightly plumed, right? And evolutionary biology is also fascinated by the kinds of elaborate mating dances and so on that take place among bird species and others. Evolutionary psychology is interested in the mating behavior of human beings. Right? Why is it that teenage males are more brightly plumed, one could argue, and why is it that they participate in very, very elaborate mating dances? I mean, that's the subject for a whole evening's conversation. We'll resist, although we're all dying to get into it. We have lots of stories to share, don't we? Why is it, though, one of the biggest questions in evolutionary psychology is the question that Bob Wright picks up on in The Moral Animal. Why is it that a given human being will sacrifice her or his life for another? Why would you ever jump into a rushing stream to rescue another human being, especially a child? Why would you rush out into traffic, right, to save someone unknown to you? What is the source of this business of altruism? Well, religion has always said it's somehow ordained by God. It's an indwelling in us of the divine. And Bob Wright says, well, it depends on what you mean by the divine. If you mean that the universe has a built-in tendency in a particular direction, I'm going to hold off on what that tendency might be because it's the next book, his next book. But if you believe that there's a built-in tendency in the universe that would incline us toward altruistic behavior, then you might be on the right track. He thinks, yes, there is. Right? Does he believe that it is indwelling as a result of the activity of a God, of a creator God? Well, he's clearly much less comfortable with that. Does he believe in a creator God that would make sense to most believing Jews, Christians, and Muslims? He wants you to know at the get-go that no, he's not comfortable with that. But if you're more comfortable with the term the divine or indwelling divinity and willing to let go of an active creator, then perhaps Bob Wright might be on your wavelength. If you're willing to let go of the idea of a God that is interventionist, that answers prayers, and he's not comfortable with that kind of thing. Actually, Bob Wright is closer to what we used to call deists than theists, right? And you know, it's a very interesting thing. These 2 words, I've always been fascinated by these 2 words, which both come from the same word, and the word is God. And the Greek word for God is theos, T-H-E-O-S, and the Latin word for God is deus, D-E-U-S. I don't have to explain to you that those are identical words. They're the same word, right? Slightly modified by dialectical evolution as Greek moves toward Latin. But theos and deus are obviously the same word, deus a little bit later. And it's just a matter of linguistic happenstance that theos gives us the word theistic and deus gives us the word deistic. I mean, it doesn't mean anything, doesn't have anything to do with Greek culture or Latin culture or anything else. But theistic means the belief, or a theistic belief, is the belief in a God that is active, interventionist, and in a nutshell, responds to prayer. Okay? So a theistic view of God is a view of God that allows for you to have a direct personal relationship with God. For a deist, God is absolutely the creator of the universe and magnificent indeed, but having created the universe and created it perfectly and created it in a law-like way, what does a deistic God do? I shouldn't say a deistic God. We're not talking about God being a deist. But in the deistic conception of God, what does that God do? That God steps back from the universe. And so we have the very common phrase in deism, Deus absconditus, God having absconded. God creates the universe, does it magnificently, endows the universe with all of the natural laws, including meteorology. Therefore, there is no room for a God that will answer your weather prayers. Because if God answers your weather prayers, what about yours? Right? And you live in the next county, and you were praying for rain, he gets the rain. What happens to meteorology and Tom Skilling and all of that? That would be among the knock-on effects. Well, anyway, so in a way, I think you would say that Bob Wright is more of a deist than a theist. He's open to the idea that there may be some sort of divine, and he'd want to put it in quotation marks and really be iffy about it, but that there might be some sort of pattern in the universe, okay? That leads us to his next book. What sort of pattern might that be? The next book is called Nonzero, The Logic of Human Destinies, Nonzero. Of all of Bob Wright's books, if you're going to read one, read that one. Read that one before you read this one. The Evolution of God is terrific. Nonzero is terrificer. And I think terrificer has to be spelled with a K. A C and a K. It is definitely terrificer. And the basic idea is this. Originally, he wanted to call it non-zero sumness. This is why there are editors in the world. And thank God his editor said, Bob, if you call it non-zero sumness, you'll sell 11 copies. If you call it non-zero, you might do better. And okay, he called it Nonzero, The Logic of Human Destinies. Here's his basic idea. There's a fundamental tendency in the universe, and by the time we get to the end of the book, and by the way, the reason I'm going into all of this is that both of these books, the idea of altruism and evolutionary psychology and so on, Bob Wright is a journalist who makes a special study of evolutionary psychology, gets so deep into it that he comes to be regarded as a colleague by evolutionary psychologists. Do you know how unusual that is? That a journalist writing about a field of science would come to be taken seriously enough that he would be invited to participate in conferences and read papers at conferences and so on. That's a very unusual thing. He is regarded as a colleague, as a partner in dialogue, as a worthy adversary and worthy engagé. You understand what I'm getting at. So he's taken very seriously. In the field of evolutionary psychology. He establishes that in his first book, The Moral Animal. Now he moves on to this amazing book, Nonzero, in which he says there is a fundamental pattern built into the universe and it is discernible. It is the steady evolutionary, cultural evolutionary, this is where my ears perk up and why Bob Wright plays a major role in my own book, a steady cultural evolutionary gradient that is evident in human affairs. And it is the steady movement in the direction of non-zero sumness. In other words, well, let me say this. He borrows the term non-zero from game theory. If you saw the movie A Beautiful Mind, about John Henry Nash? Remember the extraordinarily wacky fellow who became one of the great luminaries of economic theory and who eventually won the Nobel Prize in economics. His field, and the field for which he won the Nobel Prize, was game theory. Right? And game theory has to do with all of the wide range of human gaming activities, everything from checkers to chess to war games to developing a business plan to competition in the free market and so on. All of these matters can be addressed according to game theory, and John Henry Nash laid out a lot of the basic mathematical rules that would make that kind of application possible. Right? And he was a couple of sandwiches short of a picnic. But anyway, he was an amazing guy. In game theory, you have two major divisions between zero-sum games and non-zero-sum games. Now, you just have to bear with me on this. A zero-sum game is a game in which there are clear winners and clear losers. Right? Checkers, zero-sum? Say yes. Football, zero-sum? Yes. Basketball, all of our major competitive sports are zero-sum games. Here's the odd mathematical quirk that makes them zero-sum games. Your team and my team, we play football. You score 6 points, we score 0, but mathematically, you score 6, we end up with -6. And so what is the total sum of the game? You have beaten us by 6 points, so we're down 6. And so from a mathematical point of view, this is a zero-sum game in which there's a clear winner and a clear loser. It doesn't matter what the score is. It might be 61-8, right? But nevertheless, the deficit, I am -53, you're +53, and you add those together and it's zero-sum. Zero-sum is just a complex mathematical way of saying that there was a winner in this game and there was a loser. Now, what's a non-zero-sum game? A non-zero-sum game is a game in which all the players either win together or they lose together. So the example I always give is a barn raising. Right? What's an example of a successful barn raising? It's very simple. Barn stays up. Unsuccessful barn raising, barn falls down. Really unsuccessful barn raising, barn falls down while we're celebrating the erection of the barn inside. That's a really bad barn raising. Anyway, it's a win or lose. These are non-zero-sum games. And here's Bob Wright's extraordinarily simple and yet amazingly complex take on human history, prehistory and history in the wonderful book, Nonzero. Can't commend it to you highly enough, is that we move as a human species steadily in the direction of increasing non-zero-sumness. In other words, we learn how to cooperate. We learn how to move steadily in the direction of greater and greater interdependence. At first, we hunt as individuals, and then we hunt as groups, and eventually we hunt as groups of groups, and so on, and we find that that is more and more successful. You might say, well, wait a minute. What about the human tendency toward war? Isn't war the ultimate zero-sum game? Yes, it is. War is a zero-sum game. Are we all agreed? Clear winner, clear loser. But making war may be the ultimate non-zero-sum game. In other words, which team wins? The team that is best at cooperation, at interdependent action, right? The team that is most closely coordinated is going to prevail over, you get my drift here. So his argument is that you can trace through the development of agriculture, through the rise, and he would want to argue the eclipse, the slow eclipse of warfare, and so on, we move steadily in the direction of increasing non-zero-sumness. Right? Now, would you expect that the same thing would happen in religion? And that, of course, is the idea of his book, The Evolution of God. We only have an hour and a half, so I can't take you through all his arguments in The Evolution of God, but I thought it would be interesting and useful to introduce you to his pattern of thought and to say that the most important single idea that resonates all the way through his book, The Evolution of God, is the idea of non-zero sumness. He focuses in this book largely on the three Abrahamite or Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And in each case, he raises a question that challenges our preconceptions about those religions. In the case of Judaism, he asks the question, well, how long was it that Jews were, and the religion of the Jews was monotheistic? Common wisdom, conventional wisdom, tells us that it was from the time of Abraham, that Abraham was a monotheist, and that Moses was certainly monotheistic and so on. Robert Wright says no. He says that it's very likely that the Jewish religion, or what would eventually become Judaism, the religion of the Hebrews, but eventually what would become the religion we know as Judaism, didn't become monotheistic until the period of the exile, what's called the Babylonian exile, when Jews were carried off. Not all Jews, but the higher-ranking Jews. Lower-ranking Jews, by the way, got to stay home. And nobody wanted to haul them away anywhere, but they took the higher-ranking Jews off to what was known as the Babylonian exile, or the Babylonian captivity. And it was in that period, says Bob Wright, that monotheism came to be, that monotheism was fledged, was hatched, became really adapted to. I'll come back to that in a moment. Then he asked the question, well, what did Jesus actually teach? Right? Did Jesus actually advance all of the ideas that we associate, that true believers associate with Jesus, the notions of love and brotherhood and fellow feeling, and what you might call trans-ethnic, right? Trans-ethnic compassion. In other words, not just to our group, but to the next group. We hear the story about Jesus and the Samaritan woman, right? Now, the Samaritan woman, that's always confusing to people because Samaritan has come to mean the good Samaritan and so on. But Jesus, the story of the Samaritan who, excuse me, I just confused two stories there, would have made for an interesting story had it been true, but actually it's biblically inaccurate. But the story of the Samaritan who reaches out, right, to the Jew. Well, what was a Samaritan? A Samaritan was a foreigner. A Samaritan was a person to be shunned. A Samaritan was a person that had, in Jewish society of the time, had really no value. And certainly we would never imagine that a Samaritan would be capable of anything like generosity or compassion or kindness. And here's this Samaritan reaching out in a way that all the Jews who have passed this poor victim, you know the story, the poor brutalized victim on the streets, the Jews have walked by, and the Samaritan stops and administers some kind of aid and compassion. Is that part of the teaching of Jesus, or is it something that comes later? And Bob Wright says, to the astonishment of believing Christians, one reviewer says there's something in this book to annoy virtually everyone. And this is where the Christians get annoyed when he says, no. You have none of the love stuff in the earliest gospel, in the Gospel of Mark. You begin to see this creeping in the writings of Paul. And Paul then, in the books of Paul, by the way, are the earliest writings in the Bible. And then gradually they creep into the later Gospels and finally into the Gospel of John. And then he says, well, what about Islam? And what about the idea of jihad and holy war and so on? Today, people who want to make to build a relationship between Islam and the other Abrahamic religions want to say that actually the Prophet Muhammad said that jihad was the struggle against the enemy within. And the enemy within is greed and hatred and lack of compassion and so on. It's not the war against the enemy without. And so Bob Wright says, is that true? And he says, no, it's not true at all. That the earliest things we find from the Prophet Muhammad are in fact very warlike and very angry and very vituperative and directed against the enemies. But gradually, as Islam spreads out and becomes a more global religion, it very quickly adapts by adopting a much more generous and generic and compassionate and holistic point of view. And it's only at that time that we began to rewrite some of the earlier stories about the Prophet Muhammad. And now, in our version of stories about the Prophet, do you understand, none of this involves rewriting of the Quran. It involves only rewriting of what are called the hadith, which are the traditions concerning the Prophet, and they are eminently rewritable. And they are rewritten to have Muhammad riding into Mecca after a long struggle against the enemies of the fledgling religion of Islam and saying, today is finished the small jihad, the small holy war, in other words, where we did battle against bad people. And now begins the great jihad, where we do battle against the enemy within. But the point in all of this is that Judaism evolves, right? Judaism begins with a monotheism, or begins with polytheism, moves in the direction of monotheism, but the monotheism towards which Judaism moves after the time of the exile, where the elite of the Jews have been carried off into captivity in Babylon. Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who are the prophets at this turning point, especially Jeremiah returns, and it returns filled with anger and filled with the conviction that God will see the vengeance that the Jewish people so desperately need. And key to that vengeance is to say, there is, after all, only one God. Up until that point, the Jews had said, there are many gods, and we should honor them all. That was polytheism. Then gradually they moved into the period in which they tended to say, and he chronicles this in great detail, but I'm going to just give you the Cliff Notes version and less than the Cliff Notes version. Then we move into the period that's often referred to as monolatry, in which we say, yeah, there are many gods, but only one matters. We worship one God. You go deal with your God however you want. You want to worship Chemosh, fine. That's your business, but in a face-off between Chemosh, or as the Bible has it, in a face-off between God, Yahweh, and Baal, the most widely worshipped of the gods of people other than the Hebrew people, in a face-off between God and Baal, Baal is just going to come off second best. And you can bring out all the priests of Baal and challenge them to urge their God into some kind of miraculous action, as one priest of Yahweh or as one prophet of Yahweh urges God to act on behalf of the Hebrew people. And their God, Yahweh, will act, and Baal, for all the hundreds of priests, won't be able to muster so much as a spark. Meanwhile, Yahweh is producing lightning storms and whatever else was de rigueur at the time. But do you understand, that's monolatry. Yeah, you've got your God, but your God is a tin horn, right? That's a technical theological term that eventually passes into the American West. So you get the idea. But now, once we have been taken into captivity by the Babylonians, we are possessed of a great, as the Jewish people, we are possessed of a great resentment and a great anger, and we ask of our God nothing less than retributive monotheism. So here's a controversial argument. He says, when monotheism first appears, it appears as a doctrine of retribution and anger. O Lord, please punish those who have so wronged us, and let the first of the punishments be the denial of the very existence of their gods. It's a very different approach, isn't it, to the origin of monotheism? It's not the idea that, after all, the universe must be one and therefore the Lord must be one. It's rather a negative sort of a approach in which we're saying, essentially, you've been so rotten to us, and that's you on this side of the room. on the left hand or the right, whatever hand, that the worst thing we can say of you is that your gods, not that they're puny, but that they don't even exist. And that's the triumph of monotheism. But gradually, as monotheism begins to triumph and as it begins to develop, it makes more and more sense. It develops a philosophical argument to understand that monotheism, from the point of view of the philosopher, is always going to emerge as more consequential than polytheism. Does that make sense? That sooner or later, to the mind of the philosopher, I'm not talking about whether or not God exists. I'm talking about the idea of monotheism being more appealing philosophically than the idea of polytheism. And sooner or later, all of the great systems will come to the idea of one great God, although that God might have, as is the case of Hinduism, in Hinduism, that God has many faces. Those who believe that Hinduism is a polytheistic religion don't know anything about Hinduism. Hinduism is monistic. It's not monotheistic. Monotheistic means one personal God. Hinduism doesn't have that, but it is monistic. It's one-ish. There is one ultimate reality that has so many different faces. Why? Because we do. Right? And we need to meet God in countless different ways, and so God is amenable to that. Buddhists, also monistic. And their approach to the same thing, whereas Hindus say there are as many gods as you could possibly wish for, the Buddhists say there no gods, right? But do you understand it's the same essential argument? There is the one principle, represented in countless gods, one principle represented in no particular gods. So that tendency towards monotheism, Bob Wright says, is inexorable. It's going to happen. But, he says, what is the driving force behind it? And he says it's always going to be what he calls facts on the ground. Facts on the ground. In other words, what's going on politically, right, at the time. If at a given period in the history of the Israelites, of the Hebrew people, if we're really trying to get along with all our neighbors, what will be our tendency? Yeah, sure, we're going to be comfortable with polytheism. Otherwise, that makes the diplomatic mission impossible of attainment. Does that make sense? But as soon as we begin to have a real animus toward our neighbors and to be more and more concerned with our own existence, our own welfare, our own identity, then we're going to tend in the direction of our own God. Right? And that moves us first toward monolatry. When I was in graduate school, we called it henotheism, from a Greek root that means one. So one God among many gods, but we're going to pick one. And I'm not sure at what point henotheism gave way to the term monolatry, but I like monolatry better because we're going to worship one God. And from monolatry, polytheism, to monolatry, to monotheism. And Bob Wright says that monotheism only pops in the 6th century BCE, after the time of the exile. And he goes on to Christianity, and I just want to give you the idea that, again, we're talking about facts on the ground, right? And what are the facts on the ground as Jesus begins his ministry? What sort of a fellow was Jesus? What was Jesus all about? Here, Bob Wright, I think, borrows a page or two from the books of Dominic Crossan, John Dominic Crossan, and Marcus Borg. But especially Crossan, who used to be at DePaul University, and John Dominic Crossan is a Roman Catholic theologian, although many Roman Catholics would cast him out, but who believes that Jesus came primarily as, Jesus was primarily a social justice advocate. He was an apocalyptic preacher who believed that some kind of end times were upon us, but whether those end times were the work of a creator God who was winding it all up, or whether those end times were the result of human mismanagement of human affairs, which might fit our time, a little more closely. He believed that Jesus was there to say, unless and until we straighten up and take care of the poor and feed the hungry and do all of those things, unless we begin to address social and economic justice and what today we would call human rights, we're in deep, deep trouble. So that's Crossan's idea. Marcus Borg believes that there was a little more divinity at work in Jesus, although he has sort of a complex way of talking about that. But both would agree that Jesus talked more angrily early on in his mission, and maybe all the way through his mission, than Paul's version of things would have us believe. Now, Paul's epistles are filled with love your neighbor stuff. But one very curious omission in Paul's epistles, which Bob Wright points out, is that he never has Jesus mouthing those words. Right? Says that we should love one another and we should take care of one another and so on. But he never says, the Lord said. He never says, Jesus said. And we know that the earliest of the Gospels, although it comes after Paul, probably not influenced by Paul, but that's the Gospel of Mark. And in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is clearly in the role of an apocalyptic preacher. The end times are coming, and you really need to cut yourself off from family and mother and father and spouse and so on, and get right with God. Right? And apocalypse means, actually, apocalypse is the Greek for revelation, but it has come to us to mean the end of everything, right? And Jesus certainly has that apocalyptic notion. Well, why in the world, what would be the facts on the ground that would bring a new sense of what Jesus had said, a new reading? And maybe it is the case that one can read actual words of Jesus. Do we know any of the actual words of Jesus? No more than we know the actual words of Buddha or Muhammad. I mean, we have some pretty good leads, pretty good things to go on. The synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have similar accounts of Jesus, but almost certainly Matthew and Luke were drawing on a now vanished source that is called the Q document from the German Quelle, which means source. Which they had on their desks because they have too much in common to understand, to be explained unless they were drawing on a common source. They're very different from Mark, and all three are very different from John. So we're not exactly sure what Jesus said, but we do have a pretty good idea of what was said about what Jesus said. And we do know that gradually the words of Jesus seem to evolve in conjunction, let's say, with evolving facts on the ground. Now, what's the most important thing that we know about early Christianity? It is Paul and Paul's mission. And what was Paul trying to do? Well, Bob Wright is also going to offend Christians with this. He sees Paul as a CEO, right? True believer, a man of good heart and good soul, and he admires him very deeply and very much. But he sees him also as a guy who's trying to put together a network of churches. Right? And keep in mind, by the way, we know that Paul was a trader, and not traitor, but a trader, and he would have been trading and moving among people of very, very high class. So he would have had entree to the wealthiest homes in each of the cities that he visited. But think about the time lag. How long does it take to get from Corinth to Ephesus? Right? Now, a letter can go much more quickly than Paul can travel. And so that's why we have Paul's epistles, which are letters sent on ahead from this church to that church to that church to that. And gradually, as we look at those letters, you see the evolution of a doctrine that says you really have to look out for one another. You really have to be civil in the churches. You really have to speak kindly. You really have to be concerned and considerate and gentle and loving. And he's trying to hold together a very fractious bunch. Imagine what it must be like to plant a church here and plant a church there and a church there and a church there, and gradually you get, the occasional, Paul would have wished it were a telegram, but it wouldn't have been a telegram, but some kind of missive that would say, oi, you wouldn't believe. I'm sure oi would be part of it. You wouldn't believe what they were up to in Corinth. They were yelling and slapping and screaming, and so Paul is going to write back and say, this is how we behave ourselves. What's interesting is he never says the master would have it this way. Jesus said. Instead, he says, we do this. We love one another, and so on. So anyway, Bob Wright argues that as Christianity expanded, it became useful. It was in the interest of the expanding Christian community to be more what? More non-zero sum. And so we're moving in the direction of increasing non-zero sumness. We become more cooperative, more aware of our interdependence, and so on, as we begin to build, and the beguiled came later. That's in the Middle Ages. We first began, then we built, then we begilded. See, there are no Freudian slips. There are only anticipatory slips. The great church. And what about Muhammad? Well, Muhammad, I'm going to come back to these other two, but what about Muhammad? Well, Muhammad certainly was very strongly influenced by Christians and Jews. We know that Muhammad knew about Christians and Jews and was influenced by them. Do you realize that Muhammad lived 600 years after the time of Jesus? He's born in the late 6th century, and he dies in 632 of the Common Era, or 632 AD, right? So he's well after the time of Jesus. So Muhammad is certainly acquainted with Jewish communities and Christian communities. We know that Muhammad had a bit of a struggle when he was kicked out by the Arabs in his hometown of Mecca. He was kicked out for preaching that God was one, which was offensive to all of the different Bedouin tribes, each of whom had its own gods and goddesses and statues and so on, in the place of honor that was called the Kaaba, this great cubical stone structure in the center of Mecca, which was an oasis town. So we know he was kicked out, and he went up to the town down the road, a day or two's journey, how do I say that? A day's or two's journey away. That's still not right. Anyway, he goes to Medina, where he finds a very active Jewish community, and he struggles with them. At first he befriends them, and they invite him, the community invites him in sort of as the sheriff, because he has a reputation as a lawmaker and law builder and a bestower of peace and order and so on. But eventually he falls afoul of the Jewish community and gets a little upset with them and so on. As the Quran, which is the holy scripture of Islam that is revealed, Muslims believe, through the Prophet Muhammad by the angel Gabriel, or Jibril, as he is known to Muslims. Jibril, it's the same Gabriel, trumpet and all, it's the same angel. But he reveals the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad over the period of 22 years. And so today, a very important thing for scholars is to identify by computer study, vocabulary, and so on, and they have done a very thorough job of this, which surahs or chapters of the 114 that make up the Quran, the recitation, that's what the title of the book means, which were revealed in Mecca in the early days, and which were revealed in Medina in the later days. And one of the things we're starting to realize now, Islam has not undergone yet a revelation, I'm sorry, I didn't mean revelation, a reformation in the same way that Judaism and Christianity have, right? In the medieval and early modern periods, Judaism and Christianity underwent reformations. And by reformation, I mean a rethinking of how you ought to read Scripture. So for Jews and Christians, the idea began to develop that you needed to read Scripture with some idea of what were the facts on the ground. In other words, what were the languages that people spoke and how did people live and so on. Islam has not done that. So the great majority of the world's Muslims still take the Quran as a word-for-word, literal document that must be read exactly as it is written. But that's changing, and it's changing very rapidly. And here is the little wedge that new Quranic scholars are beginning to insert. It's the wedge between the Meccan verses and the Medinan verses. And when Muhammad is speaking, now, again, I've just offended Muslims. When God is speaking through Gabriel, through Jibril, to Muhammad in Mecca, God seems to take a much more universalistic tone. When God is speaking through Jibril to Muhammad in Medina, God seems to have an attitude, seems to be a little ticked off. So this is where we would find the verses that say, if you meet the unbelievers, strike them down, right? Kill them. Whereas if we look at the earlier, at the Meccan surahs or the Meccan chapters, you find verses like this. I could have made you all one people, but I made you different, that you might come to know one another. Right? You've got that on the one side, and on the other side you have, if you meet the unbelievers, kill them. Well, Bob Wright takes us a little more deeply into some of those problematic verses. And he says, first of all, you have to recognize that you've got one set of circumstances in Mecca and a different set of circumstances in Medina. Muhammad is beset by enemies from Mecca, his own clansmen and so on, who are trying to exterminate this new religious social movement. And he's got enemies in Medina, Jews and others, who aren't particularly crazy about his new model, Jews and Arabs and some Christians and so on, that are also joining forces with the Meccans to exterminate this new group that calls itself the believers or the Muslims. So he says that's going on, but he also says, let's take a closer look at some of these verses that are now all over the internet. Google something like hate Muslims or Muslim hate would be better, although it's going to yield the same search results, as you know. And you'll find all kinds of quotations from the Quran about kill the infidels and chop off their heads and so on. But if you find, for example, the most often cited verse, which is a verse that says, have no mercy, show no mercy to the infidel, strike them down where you meet them, and so on. If you read the verse before and the verse after, it's thrown into very different sort of perspective. In the verse before, we read that if these, and first of all, I have to clarify one thing. Nowhere does it say infidel. Infidels are unbelievers. Are Jews and Christians infidels in the Muslim point of view? Absolutely not. I see people nodding. Absolutely not. Jews and Christians are people to whom God has given a true book. Is Torah a revelation from God? Now, this is where you want to say yes. Is the New Testament a revelation from God? Are the Hindu scriptures revelations from God? Yes, yes, yes. Muslims have divided opinions about Buddhist scripture. But Jews, Christians, absolutely. People of the book. The term in Arabic is dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I, dhimmi, people of the book. So they are never, ever, Jews and Christians are never infidels. The term that's used in these verses is polytheists, right? The worshipers of many gods and many idols. And the verse before the verse that says, when you meet these polytheists, just kill them. Right? The verse before says, sometimes the polytheists will come to you, and they will try to make common cause with you. And when they do, by all means, agree, right? And make whatever arrangements you can with them and honor them. Right? And the verse after says, if the polytheists do not oppose you in war, do not raise a hand against them. So what are we left with? We're left with a verse that says, kill those who come against you in war. And who would that be? Polytheists, right? So is it a blanket sort of indictment of all polytheists, or simply a statement that you really need to bring it all when you're involved in combat, right? Now that, by the way, that kind of thing we find in Torah. We find it in the book of Revelations, in the Christian New Testament. Remember that when Moses entered the promised land we now refer to as Canaan, And Canaan was not empty. It's sort of, there are several parallels. It's the idea of the so-called the Americans coming into this empty land that was North America, only it wasn't empty. There's somewhere between 20 and 100 million, scholars disagree. The average opinion is something about 60 million inhabitants of North America. Within 50 years, 90% were dead, almost all from disease that was brought by the conquest and so on. So that's one example. The other is the sort of occupation of Israel. And again, the common folklore is that this was an empty land for a people who had no land. A people who had no land came to a land that had no people. That's Golda Meir said that again and again and again. David Ben-Gurion said that. Well, it was never true, right? The land wasn't empty. It wasn't empty. Well, by the same token, Canaan wasn't empty. And if you read Torah, the idea is you put to the sword the men, women, and children who are the worshipers of the idols and so on. It's nothing more violent than we find in Quran. We find more of that in Quran than we find in Torah, but it's the same kind of thing, and you find that kind of violence also in the book of Revelation. So Bob Wright would say this: it really depends on the facts on the ground. Once Islam becomes a religion of empire, and once Christianity becomes a religion of empire, and once Judaism is left to its own devices, Judaism never becomes a religion of empire, but eventually it is allowed simply to exist. And the same thing happens in all three. They become universalistic, right? They become all-embracing. And Christianity, although eventually it will revert and it will go through its periods of inquisition and so on, but nevertheless, it will develop doctrines of universal truth. Those doctrines of universal truth will be abused and misused because it becomes a hierarchical superstructure. And so we can say there's a universal truth, but as long as you deny the universal truth, we've got no room for you in our universe, and we have ways of dealing with you. Same thing is true of Islam and so on. But Islam will gradually become much more a universalistic religion. And now, when we tell the story of Muhammad riding triumphant back into Mecca after his long struggle against the Jews and the angry Meccans and the non-Muslims to defeat his new religion and his new people, now we have a Muhammad that instead of being triumphant and exultant and angry, gets down off his horse or camel or whatever they had going at the time and says, today is finished the small jihad. Tomorrow begins the great jihad. That's a very late verse. Today, apologists for Islam, and I'm one of them, I mean, people who want to say you need to know more about Islam, will often turn to that verse, but we need to be aware that that's a late blooming verse. Almost certainly Muhammad did not utter that. But by the same token, Bob Wright would say, almost certainly Jesus never talked much turn the other cheek kind of stuff. That was added in later. Now, he says, and I'll wind up here, he says, look, you may find this disappointing, but he says, I find it heartening and hopeful that religion can develop, that religion can evolve, that religion, how important is it to Christians that Jesus said all this stuff? Tom Robbins wrote a book years ago. Do you know Tom Robbins? He wrote a book called Another Roadside Attraction. Anybody ever read that? Go get it. You did. Well, we're married, of course. We read many of the same books, not coincidentally. But Another Roadside Attraction, what do you suppose it was? Somebody finds the body of Jesus. Again, I'm tempted to say, oi. I mean, because this would this destroy Christianity? To discover the body of Jesus? Or would that simply be interesting but inconsequential? Right? The question is, are the teachings valid? Are the teachings uplifting? Are the teachings a source of real spiritual growth and transformation and that sort of thing? Right? One might say in a theosophical context, if we found that there were no adepts, right? That there were no, or in other traditions that believe in enlightened masters and so on. What if we found, no, there never were, right? But you still have this body of teachings. And as the Buddha used to say, Buddhism, this is my favorite one-liner from the Buddha, he says, the Dharma is an ehipassika kind of thing. In Sanskrit, ehi means come. Pasi means open your eyes and see. Ka just makes it an adjective. So ehipassika means the Dharma is a come and see thing. Nobody's asking you to believe anything on credit or believe anything on the testimony of the master. Check it out. It's all a testable hypothesis. So if you find out there are no ascended masters, or you find out that Jesus did not ascend, right? And I'm not arguing for either of those points, but do you understand, does the teaching still have validity? And that, I think, is what Bob Wright is trying to argue. He says, I know it's a disappointment to people to hear that perhaps Jesus didn't have the peace and love message, that it was not fledged yet. It was going to develop through Paul and then later through the living tradition of Christianity. That Judaism, its turn to monotheism, was a turn to an angry, retributive, vituperative, punitive monotheism. The theme of which was, Lord, get those people. But gradually that monotheism evolved into the monotheistic ethics and the universal ethical monotheism that we associate with Judaism today, right? Judaism, probably the first of the great religions ever to say our outreach must cross our ethnic lines. At some point, Christianity moves from an ethnic engagement to a trans-ethnic engagement. And Islam does the same. Right? Today, one of the great moving themes, it seems to me, in the new Islamic Reformation that's underway is a trans-Islamic outreach. What should be our position vis-a-vis those who are outside the Islamic faith? It used to be that Muslims referred to the world of Islam, and they still do, many of them, as Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam. And the outside world, was referred to as Dar al-Harb, which is the world of war, right? Right? Now Muslims are referring to the world of the others, right? And even to the world of brothers and sisters. Well, that's an extraordinary kind of transformation. And you understand, once something like that gets unleashed, and once one other important thing happens that's happening in Islam today, and that's starting to happen more and more in Christianity and Judaism, and that is the opening up of ministry to women. I think it's absolutely essential. Judaism has sort of taken the lead, but not Orthodox, and conservative Judaism is slow. It's strong in Reform Judaism. It's strong in progressive Christianity. It's very slow. Southern Baptist Church, not long ago, reiterated that God wants women to be subservient to men. Submissive was actually the term that they used. Apparently without any awareness of the larger cultural implications of the term submission, sexual implications of that, and Islam still is struggling to come to a willingness to hear the voices of women, but it's starting to happen. Well, when you combine that, the voices of women, with an outreach to people that lie beyond the confines, I was going to say beyond the pale, but that means something else, beyond the confines of one's religion, you're really moving in the direction of cultural evolution. So Bob Wright says, and I promise I'll wind up here, he says, you may be disappointed to find out that these religions were not as early enlightened as you thought they were, right? That Jesus had not yet crossed the line into trans-ethnic compassion, right? That the Prophet Muhammad had not yet spoken the words about the great Jihad, the struggle against the internal enemy, and that the first venture, the first foray into monotheism, that marked the emergence of what we know as Judaism did not come as an outpouring of universalism or transethnic generosity, but just the opposite. Nevertheless, look what's happened in each of these religions. And so he asks at the beginning of the book, and then at the end, he says, how much hope is there for a real coming together of the three Abrahamic religions, and by extension of religions of the world? And he says it's something that he not only dares to hope for, but is rather convinced is in the cards. Anybody want to jump in here? I said I'd allow 10 minutes or so before we have to start signing the book. I'm
We have
just
a question
guessing that
from the
that's how many
internet.
will sell. Yes.
From cyberspace, someone wants to know, can atheism lead one to mysticism, or are the two mutually exclusive?
Well, it's a very good question. Can atheism lead one to mysticism, or are the two mutually exclusive? One of the most mystical, if by mystical we mean, or we refer, let's say, when we use a term like mystical, and it means so many different things, but we're talking about the possibility of a direct experience of ultimate reality. Fair enough? Whatever it is that's most real can be directly experienced, so the mystic would argue. Well, one of the most mystical of the world's religions has no use for the concept of God, and that's Buddhism. Right? Buddhism used to be described as the atheistic religion until gradually scholars realized that you don't define anything in a negative. Aristotle said anything that you can only define in the negative you don't understand well enough to talk about. So to say that Buddhism is an atheistic religion is not to say anything about Buddhism, but Buddhists certainly don't talk about a creator God or a personal God or anything else. So it's reasonable to say that Buddhism has an atheistic character, and yet it's deeply mystical. Here's another interesting spin on that. You know, Sam Harris, who is the author of two books, one is The End of Faith, and the other is Letter to a Christian Nation. And Sam Harris is one of this new breed of atheists that includes Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett and so on, that have made such a splash recently. And Sam Harris is very angry about religion, and he's very angry about liberal religion. He says, you might think that I'm only upset about fundamentalists. No, I'm much more upset about moderate and progressive religionists, because your very tolerance of fundamentalism empowers these people. Right? So he thinks religion is bad for you. Don't expose your kids to it. Make it go away. But he's a Zen practitioner. Well, what does that mean? How is that possible? Well, because Zen practice, as you know well, doesn't involve in any way the idea of a deity or a creator or a God and so on. So I would say this. I would go so far as to say that most mystical practice carried far enough leaves God, don't misunderstand me, behind. Meister Eckhart, the great 14th century Christian mystic, I know I'm overdoing this, my apologies to, and is there really someone named Cyberspace? Meister Eckhart, 14th century Christian Rhineland mystic, said this: for the love of God, I would take leave of the idea of God. So is mysticism possible in the absence of any kind of devotion to a personal God? Clearly, it is. I think. Yes.
Any other questions? I'm coming with the microphone.
She needs the microphone. Yeah. Thanks, Sochi.
Do you have any idea what the next book of Robert Wright is going to be about?
I think it's going to be about motorcycle maintenance. I heard that. No, I don't. I don't know. No, I guess somebody's already done that. I don't know. But I can tell you this, that as soon as it's out, I'm going to grab it up. But again, let me just tell you, as much as I love the evolution of God, I really think, I think everybody should read this book, but I think everybody should read Nonzero. It's absolutely spectacular. Or the short form is to read chapter 3 of my book, in which you get Bob Wright in about five pages. Now, read his book, of course.
When you talked about evolution, I was curious about the breakdown of the bicameral mind. Did you think that the mind changed, the brainstem of early humans, and then the way we connected with God?
You're talking about Julian Jayne?
Yeah.
Right. And the breakdown of the bicameral mind. What was what was the title of the book? I know that was the subtitle.
I think it's,
It's been so long.
I know that that's a subtitle. I don't recall.
But you're
Sorry.
right. That's
I do
the idea, is the
apologize.
breakdown of the bicameral mind. And I think that I loved that book, right? It really changed my thinking, Julian Jayne. But it hasn't been borne out. You know, that's not a book that has been followed up by supportive scholarship that says, oh, he was really onto something physically. But I think he was onto something sociologically and culturally. And even if it's not, do you understand, if we can divorce, he believed that there was something that actually happened in the evolution of our two-chambered mind, of our two-hemisphered mind, that told us something about human culture. I don't think that that has panned out, the physical side of it, but I sure think his analysis of culture has been a very important one. And so all I would say is that it's had a huge impact on me. But I don't think, well, let me put it this way. Do I think it has something to do, the two-hemisphered mind? Does it have something to do with our approach to religion? Certainly it does. But do you understand even that old left brain, right brain stuff on which we were all, as younger folks, as young, intellectuals venturing our first radical ideas, we were all into that, weren't we? That left brain, right brain stuff, that also hasn't quite panned out. Turns out that it's not as consistent as we thought. There are radical differences between Eastern and Western cultures, even involving the reversal, perhaps, of those hemispheres. Nevertheless, forget about the hemisphерicality, right? Forget about the brain architecture and say, is there a capacity in human beings to think about things in a linear kind of way? And is there a built-in capacity in human beings to think of things in a relational kind of way? Does it make sense to talk about the difference between intellect and intuition? And I think that makes as much sense as it ever did. And I think that is an absolutely critical thing to invoke as we talk about the nature of religion and spirituality. And the next book that I'm thinking about will talk about this whole business of sea change, of cultural evolution, and living through a time of accelerated cultural evolution, but specifically with regard to spirituality. And this is one thing I really want to explore. So that's a great question. Thank you.
And we Googled Jane's book, and the head title is The Origin of Consciousness.
The origin of consciousness in the breakdown of the bicameral mind? I think it's... Or it might be and. Okay, thank you. We've got that cleared up. Don't you like it when something comes together? Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you very much. I certainly appreciate this. I want to recommend to you what I think is the best single review of this book, and you'll find it on Salon.com. Are you aware? I'm sure most of you are aware of Salon. Which is an e-zine. It is a magazine that is only on the internet, and it is, of course, at salon.com. This is an article by a guy named Steve Paulson, and it also has the greatest title of all, God, he's moody. God, he's moody. And this is how Bob Wright begins the book. He says, how do we make sense of the fact that now God is in a terrific mood, and everybody is his child? And now God is destroying left and right. How do we make sense of that? And Bob Wright goes on to say, you can't answer those questions about the mood of God without asking the question, what are the facts on the ground? So is it God that evolves? No. It's people that evolve and people's ideas of God that evolve. So if you want this book in a very entertaining nutshell, Google God, He's Moody. Okay, thank you.